everybody, welcome to Red Tool House. On our YouTube channel, we talk about all things homesteading and try to implement some of those things on our rural 100 acres in southern West Virginia. So imagine walking through the woods and you find a nice tract of land that you think, well, I'd really like to have this land. I'd like to lay claim to it. So coming to a convergence of two streams, or you come across a large spring, you decide to take out your hatchet, your tomahawk, if you have a tomahawk, and you proceed to deaden trees around you, around that spring or around that convergence of those streams. You deaden the trees by chipping the bark away, wringing the tree so it dies out. And then one of the main trees you stop and you carve your initials in that tree. And at that point, you've just laid claim to 400 acres of land. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Well, if you were actually in the American colonies in the 18th century, maybe around the Virginia, Pennsylvania colonies, you could have done just that. That was called a tomahawk claim or a cabin claim. You're claiming rights to land. You're laying claim to as much as 400 acres of land. And you could actually attach another 1,000 acres of land adjoining, up to 1,000 acres, if it was adjoining that 400 acre claim. So this simple marking of the trees around, deadening the trees, and then putting your initials on a spot, what would be your official claim. Well, the tomahawk claim was actually a very rudimentary way of claiming land, and actually wasn't officially ratified until the Land Patent Office issued the patent on that grant. But in Appalachia, as well as other places, those tomahawk claims were actually viewed as legitimate by many of the settlers. And they would actually trade or sell their claims back and forth to one another when they had needs or they needed finances. Well, if you've watched some of our other videos about homestead history, I'd mentioned how I like to go back and look at source documentation or look at original letters, manuscripts from those times to really get a good idea of what was going on in that area in that time. There's a book called American History Told by Contemporaries that you can actually find on archive.com, the original manuscript. I will post a link below to that. And that book's been digitized, but that book gives all kinds of historical accounts through memos, letters, manuscripts of contemporaries during that period, colonial period. Actually, it goes from the 1600s to the late 1800s, telling American history from people living it out. And it's a very interesting read. It's about 800 and some pages. There's an account in that book written by Reverend Joseph Doddridge that gives detail to the tomahawk claim. There was, at an early period of our settlements, an inferior kind of land title denominated a tomahawk right, which was made by deadening a few trees near the head of a spring and marking the bark of someone or more of them with the initials of the name of the person who made the improvement. I remember having seen a number of those tomahawk rights when I was a boy. For a long time, many of them bore the names of those who made them. I have no knowledge of the efficacy of the tomahawk improvement or whether it conferred any right whatever, unless followed by an actual settlement. These rights, however, were often bought and sold. Those who wished to make settlements on their favorite tract of land bought up the tomahawk improvements rather than enter into quarrels with those who had made them. Other improvers of the land with a view to actual settlement, and who happened to be stout veteran fellows, took a very different course from that of purchasing the tomahawk rights. When annoyed by the claimant under those rights, they deliberately cut a few good hickories and gave them what was called in those days a laced jacket. That is, a sound whipping. Well, the more official way to lay a claim to land of the 400 acres was to do what's called a settlement claim or a cabin claim. The settlement claim meant that you were going to do just that. You were going to settle it. You were required to build a dwelling of some sort. It could be very rudimentary. You built a cabin and you had to raise a crop. It could be a very small crop, didn't have to be a huge crop. But if you prove that you built a house, built a cabin, and you raised a crop, then the patent office could issue the patent on your land claim. Land was the object, which invited the greater number of these people to cross the mountain. For as the saying then was, it was to be had here for taking up. That is, building a cabin and raising a crop of grain, however small, of any kind, entitled the occupant to 400 acres of land, and a preemption right to 1,000 acres more adjoining, to be secured by the land office warrant. This right was to take effect if there happened to be so much vacant land or any part thereof adjoining the tract secured by the settlement right. At an early period, the governor of Virginia appointed 3 commissioners to give certificates of settlement rights. These certificates, together with a surveyor's plat, were sent to the land office of the state, where they laid 6 months to wait any caveat which might be offered. If none was offered, the patent then issued. Now, Doddridge's account actually takes place in the 1770s, and geographically takes place in western Pennsylvania, near Uniontown, Pennsylvania, in an area along the Monongalia River that, of course, flows into Pittsburgh, joins the Allegheny, and creates the Ohio River. And they would have had to travel, they had a small road that they could travel called Braddock's Road. And this road here on our property probably would look like a highway compared to what Braddock's Road was like at that time. Braddock's Road, General Braddock was commissioned to build that road during the French and Indian War in an attempt to make passage to Fort Duquesne, which is in Pittsburgh. And the goal was to drive the French from Fort Duquesne during the French and Indian War. George Washington actually served under General Braddock during that time and was part of that campaign. So these settlers had to come from eastern Pennsylvania, from Maryland, from the eastern Virginia colonies, and they're trying to cross the mountains, trying to cross some real rugged terrain. The Appalachian Mountains are pretty rugged. Try to cross that terrain and come into these areas and lay claim to land. And you think about it, this is homesteading in its purest form. These people really didn't have much, just basic provision. Doddridge's account even talks about how not everyone brought their entire family, because some families were too large where they couldn't come over in one trip. Maybe the wagon or whatever modes of transportation they were using at the time, they didn't have enough room to bring the entire family. So sometimes they would bring them over multiple trips. Sometimes they wouldn't bring the whole family, but they're coming over with basic provisions, laying claim to land. And of course they had to worry about the climate, the harsh winters, storms coming up. They had to worry about, of course, just transportation in general, getting a lot of miles to cover, either on foot or by horse or by wagon. And of course they had to worry about Indian attacks. The Indian attacks were really a big issue back then at that time. And so these settlers were coming into Indian territory, and the Indians were threatened by the settlements. So you think about it, we think about homesteading today and think, well, homesteading is kind of tough, all the things that we have to face, all the things we have to deal with. Well, what we have is nothing compared to what they had to deal with in the 18th century. When we have an issue with our crop, we obviously just get up and go to the supermarket and buy food to supplement our crop failure or our animal failure. Back in those days, you'd starve to death unless a fellow settler would help you out in that situation. So homesteading would have been very tough back then, and Doddridge actually gives an account of that personally from their experience in crossing over and trying to settle land. Some of the early settlers took the precaution to come over the mountains in the spring, leaving their families behind to raise a crop of corn, and then return to bring them out in the fall. This, I should think, was the better way. Others, especially those whose families were small, brought them with them in the spring. My father took the latter course. His family was but small, and he brought them all with him. The Indian meal which he brought over the mountain was expended 6 weeks too soon, so that for that length of time we had to live without bread. The lean venison and the breasts of the wild turkeys we were taught to call bread. The flesh of the bear was a denominated meat. This artifice did not succeed very well. After living this way for some time, we became sickly. The stomach seemed to be always empty, and tormented with a sense of hunger. I remember how narrowly the children watched the growth of the potato tops, pumpkins and squash vines, hoping from day to day to get something to answer in place of bread. How delicious was the taste of young potatoes when we got them. What a jubilee when we were permitted to pull the young corn for roasting ears. Still more so when it had acquired sufficient hardness to be made into johnny cakes by the aid of a 10 grater. We then became healthy, vigorous, and contented with our situation, poor as it was. Doddridge's account also details how some families would only come over in the spring and stay to the fall and leave before winter so they could avoid those harsh winters and be able to raise a crop, that way they could lay claim to that land, that 400 acres, and of course that 1,000 they could add on. So some people wouldn't even stick it out for the winter time because they knew they're not going to be able to survive these harsh Appalachian winters. So when you think about some of the struggles you face with building your homestead now, what we consider modern homesteading, if you get a little frustrated and you think you're going to give up or you just can't figure it out, just think back to what some of our ancestors, maybe not your ancestors, but some of our ancestors had to deal with back in the 18th century. You know, worried about running out of food, worried about getting clean water, worried about staying warm or surviving a cold winter, worried about getting an arrow shot in your face, of course. We obviously don't have those type of concerns these days. So don't let any setbacks you have in homesteading, anything you're trying to do, frustrate you to the point that you give up. Think back 200 years ago to what those people had to deal with. Much different time. One side note in Doddridge's account is that in 1773 they started their settlement in this area, but in 1774 they actually had to abandon it completely due to Lord Dunmore's war, kind of stirring up the Indians. So Indian attack was going on all through that area, so they had to pull back further east into areas that were more fortified. So I encourage you to check out that book. Again, I'll provide the link below so you can check it out. There's tons and tons of information. And maybe I'll do another video. There's a couple other excerpts from there that I think apply to what we do as far as homesteading goes. The book covers politics and colonization and all those type of things, which doesn't really fit within our topic. But there are a couple other excerpts that I think would be applicable to our discussion. Well, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Comment below if you like the history stuff. I've done a couple history type videos on homesteading and I've gotten good feedback. I won't do a bunch of them because I'd like to stay with hands-on practical stuff, but I think it's interesting to look back at times to see the history on homesteading. Take care, everybody.